Anyone remember Southfront? The channel has grown in recent months and pro-Putin activists are still racing towards it, worshipping it like a Kremlin cult. It has been so solidified that they've recently focused their videos on war report stories where, just like last time, they put no sources and have no footage of their own. But here and there they will just upload certain analysis videos where they attack and drag down Western nations. The one that has recently gotten my attention is their lovely essay on how the US is woefully unprepared for a global conflict with another world power. For this video, I'm not going to do a point-by-point response because first of all, it's half an hour long, and second of all, I don't need to because all of Southfront's arguments are just summed up to a few points while glorifying the militaries of Russia and China. They bit off more than they can chew in this video, as all of their points are wrong. If you look at the comments in that video, you will see that everyone is dismissing it as propaganda. I'm so glad that Krembot's works are starting to develop cracks. But without further ado, let's go into each of these points that Southfront makes in their impotent video. The first one is the argument that the US ground forces have shifted their role to counterinsurgency and occupation actions as seen by recent wars in the Middle East.
In the Department of Defense authored summary of the National Defense Strategy of the United States for 2018, Secretary James Mattis quite succinctly sets out the challenges and goals of the U.S. military in the immediate future. He acknowledges that the U.S. had become far too focused on counterinsurgency over the past 2 decades, but he seems to miss the causation of this fixation in the first place. The United States engaged in costly and unnecessary wars, and when these wars were easily won on the immediate battlefield, the unplanned for occupations led to guerrilla insurgencies that a conventional military is ill-prepared to confront. The US military and the defense industry were forced to find ways to adapt tactics and equipment to this new kind of conflict, thus shifting the main effort away from fighting conventional wars against peer adversaries. The United States military would become a force for invasion and occupation during the neocon era spanning from 2000 to the present. This overemphasis on special operations has resulted in atrophying of more conventional combat forces. Secretary Mattis has obviously recognized the need to focus higher procurement towards conventional forces, as well as fund R&D efforts into developing a new field artillery, rocket artillery, armored fighting vehicles such as the AMPV, and a new main battle tank, MBT. In identifying near-peer adversaries as the greatest national security threat, Secretary Mattis realizes that the US must waste no time in closing the technological and quality gap that now exists between the conventional fighting forces of the United States and Russia and China, respectively. Abandon the obsession with counterinsurgency and occupation and realign the focus of the army on the defense of a homeland and a handful of historical allies. Rebuild the army as a lean and well-equipped conventional fighting force. The focus should be on defense of the nation's own territories, while also safeguarding the economic interests and maritime trade lanes that are the lifeblood of any nation. All legacy systems that have proven capable and efficient on the modern battlefield should be refurbished and upgraded to the most modern standard, the M2 Bradley.
So in regards to the army, Southfront claims that the US has lost all incentive to fight a powerful nation directly because it has only focused on fighting wars in the Middle East, while just like many Krembots stating that the conventional forces of Russia and China are now superior to that of US conventional forces. In regards to the US military being reduced to an occupying force, this is very untrue. The US is still the leading nation in terms of mobility, tactics, deployment, and technology. 2 wars in the Middle East have not changed that. The US's military's troops operate in the sense that they match their fighting forces to the needs of the battlefield. In other words, they have the equipment and the overall training to adapt to the current war at hand. Every enemy that has fought the US after World War II has resulted in unsustainable casualties, whether it be the Chinese in the Korean War, or the Iraqi army, which had the 5th largest military in the world during the invasion phase of the war. Why is that so? Because the US has the technology, knowledge, and finances to adapt to any hostile environment. An asymmetric guerrilla war is always hard for the invading force because they don't have home field advantage in that sector. That has been the cause of America losing wars in Vietnam or Iraq. The Soviet Union itself experienced this when invading Afghanistan. Are the Russians able to fight a conventional conflict? According to Southfront, they are. The same applies for the US. Ever since the war in Ukraine, NATO has bolstered its presence in Eastern Europe to reassure allies, and for the past 5 years has been training for a conventional armed conflict, obviously aimed at Russia. In the event Russia actually does invade the Baltic states or Finland, the NATO forces in these regions would act on a defensive posture to hold Russian forces until reinforcements arrived from the US and Western Europe, something that the Russian army wouldn't be able to hold out on. In this kind of scenario, Russia's only hope is to try and quickly capture the Baltics and use Belarus to cut off the three states from the rest of Europe and use them as a bargaining chip with the threat of further escalating the conflict to achieve their goals. But even this is put into question. NATO states' forces and economies are simply too powerful for Russia to handle, even when allied with China, especially not with the fact that Kaliningrad is a piece of Russian territory that is isolated between NATO states, meaning that NATO allies could quickly occupy the region and use it as a bargaining chip themselves. And obviously, any war with Russia and China isn't going to stay in Europe, as there would also be airstrikes all over North America and possible troop deployments in Alaska, which is very close to the Russian border.
The head of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, warning a new generation of Russian cruise missiles could strike critical military radars and missiles inside the United States.
The development of the cruise missiles that they have that have a very long range, that from Eastern Russia, they can range critical infrastructure in Alaska and in Canada that we rely on for a homeland defense mission.
But the thing is, any incursion into the US would only serve to try and distract the US from other regions of the world. I can see Russia or China launching airstrikes on the US and even occupying a piece of it, but this would only be used as a tactical advantage, as neither Russia nor China have the logistics or the money to fight on US soil for a prolonged period of time, especially not while they're on two fronts. Fighting China in the South China Sea doesn't look good for China either. Other than the US having a more competent navy, it has more allies in the region where they would have land-based support and quick supply routes, while China would have to find a way to forward a sizable battle group to the South China Sea to ward off all enemy forces there. Furthermore, the islands are quite exposed and vulnerable to certain attacks, which will make it very hard for China to fight and defend them in that area. Any conflict there is way too complicated for China. But the funny part of their analysis is stating that Russian and Chinese conventional troops are more technologically advanced than that of the US.
In identifying near-peer adversaries as the greatest national security threat, Secretary Mattis realizes that the US must waste no time in closing the technological and quality gap that now exists between the conventional fighting forces of the United States and Russia and China, respectively. Of greatest importance is the rejuvenation of the armored and mechanized units of the U.S. Army. The M1126 Stryker family of wheeled armored vehicles cannot bear the weight of a conventional conflict with either Russia or China. The current carrier air wing as it stands, even with the introduction of the F-35, is of little utility against a peer adversary such as Russia or China. The United States must acquire both an SSN and SSBN to replace the Los Angeles and Ohio-class vessels that are approaching the end of their service lives. There is no greater defensive role for the U.S. Navy in ensuring the security of the nation than the continued operation of its attack and ballistic missile submarine forces. Both Russia and China understand this and have greatly modernized their own submarine forces. Much of the success they have achieved in pushing the envelope of submarine design was due to their intense competition with the U.S. Navy submarine force that was always at the cutting edge of subsurface warfare. Russia and China have spent the same time wasted by the U.S. Navy on updating and modernizing their own submarine forces, chiefly their ballistic missile submarines. As the United States plays catch-up after decades of military adventurism, China and Russia have spent that time patiently and judiciously gathering their strength. The scenario of a one-sided victory in favor of the United States is pure fantasy.
Let's start by saying that neither Russia nor China have the economies that the West has, and their military budgets are not as big and invest much less in research and development for their militaries. The Russian military isn't well equipped or well funded. Most of their equipment and military vehicles are just upgraded holdovers from the Soviet Union. They do have some fifth-generation weapons like the Sukhoi 35 and the T-14 Armata, but even they have their shortcomings. The Sukhoi 35 has an advantage for being agile, but it lacks the surface-ceiling radar specification and range. Even war games between European nations and India have shown that the Eurofighter is still a competent force against it. The Russian government has also boasted about how the Armada is the best tank in the world, but only 20 have been produced. Furthermore, it has never seen frontline combat, and the only people who have officially commented on it are the producers. No one really knows what the real capabilities of the Armada are. The main battle tank of the Russian military is still the T-72, a third-generation tank, and regardless of the fact that it has more of them, they aren't going to hold up against a NATO helicopter fleet with Brimstone and Hellfire missiles. China isn't technologically superior either. While they have been increasing their military budget, they're still not close to the West. Until recently, they've been getting most of their weapons from Russia, and even with their own new weapons such as the J-10 fighter, 11 Fire, the T-99 tank, or Z-10 attack helicopter, they still lag behind. China is the only member of the UN Security Council that doesn't have the capability to produce their own aircraft carrier, and the only one they have was a retrofitted one they bought from the Ukraine in 2012, of which no one really knows what the capabilities are. According to reports, a single infantryman in the Chinese military is allocated about $1,500 for his entire gear, and almost half of that is just to his service rifle, the QBZ-95. By comparison, it costs the Department of Defense $17,500 to equip a single U.S. infantryman with weapons, body armor, and high-tech gear. You simply cannot compare the two in terms of quality. Even the Chinese acknowledge this, as General Yao Yunzu of the Chinese Academy of Military Science states that the gap between the U.S. and Chinese militaries is 30, maybe 50 years. But our lovely friends don't stop with the Army. Their next stop is the US's naval forces attacking aircraft carriers and certain ships.
While the ground forces of the United States have suffered from 2 decades of occupation and counterinsurgency, the US Navy seems to have lost any idea of its national security role. After 2 decades of enjoying uncontested control of the seas and the ability to use aircraft carrier-borne airstrikes to pummel inferior adversaries, none of which possessed a viable navy or air force, nor a modern air defense network or shore-based anti-naval capability, the US Navy has seemed determined to sail further into the realm of irrelevancy in any further conflict. Regardless, the US Navy apparently has decided it is an indomitable force that can go wherever it pleases without opposition. Such hubris and arrogance are one of the reasons why it is in such poor shape today. The other reason must surely be attributed to a military-industrial complex that has sold the service on an expensive pipe dream of high-tech weapons that have failed to live up to their hype, all to the tune of huge profits. The following are the most egregious examples. Based on a flawed concept from the start, a radical departure from a traditional multi-purpose design, the Littoral combat ship was largely doomed for a number of reasons. 2 different designs rewarded contracts, the Independent class, designed by General Dynamics, and the Freedom class, designed by Lockheed Martin. The decision to produce 2 different designs to meet the needs of a single class should have been seen as problematic. Here the Navy accepted the responsibility and costs associated with maintaining 2 different platforms with separate maintenance needs and schedules, not to mention 2 separate training programs for LCS crews. The concept of the LCS was also divergent in many respects, and quite frankly, too much was expected of a ship that was smaller in size than a conventional frigate. What resulted was what those serving in the force would begrudgingly coin the little crappy ship. The aluminium and composite, Independence class, and lightweight steel or Freedom class hulls of the ship provide little armored protection. Offensive striking power is totally inadequate, the platform has yet to meet many of its design requirements, and the reduced crew size has been determined to be unmanageable. If the LCS was not a huge and unequivocal disappointment, then the much-vaulted stealth destroyer, the DDG-1000 Zumwalt class, was a total embarrassment and unmitigated failure. Envisioned as a high-tech game-changer, the DDG-1000 was supposed to make use of powerful new technologies, overwhelming firepower, and massive power generation, all wrapped in stealth that would render it invisible. Although designed as a multi-mission surface combatant, added emphasis was put on Naval Surface Fire Support, NSFS, while operating in littoral waters. Originally, the Navy intended to build 32 of these stealth destroyers, yet the exorbitant initial cost plus huge cost overruns led the Navy and the US Congress to reduce the fleet repeatedly, finally settling on only 3 vessels. The US Navy is now struggling to find a new role for the DDG-1000s. Now that its fire support mission is a non-starter, it has been adapted as a platform to strike inland targets with land attack cruise missiles and engage other surface ships with an anti-ship cruise missile that has yet to be fielded. In an attempt to utilize the USS Zumwalt, the Navy has added legacy weapon systems, radars, and communications antennas to the stealthy superstructure, undoubtedly negating its minimal radar signature. It remains to be seen what munitions will be provided for the two AGS turrets, as no munitions other than the cost-prohibitive LRLAP exist.
And Southfront just debunked itself in the second half. Regarding the LCS, while they do have many problems, they aren't designed for combat on the open waters. They were made to deliver special forces to shore and provide support for them. They're more fitted for use in humanitarian assistance, support, and security cooperation with partner nations. As for the Zumwalt, it is way too soon to label it as a flailer, as they're still going through teething problem stages. Unlike the LCS, it has practical and strategic uses for the Navy. But now let's turn our attention to the aircraft carrier.
Not content with wasting $38 billion on the failed LCS and DDG-1000 programs, an even more grandiose undertaking was envisioned for the service that would revolutionize the largely obsolete supercarrier. It is widely accepted fact that the US Navy has been obsessed with the aircraft carrier since World War II and the pivotal naval battles between the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. This obsession is alive and well to this day, seemingly immune to the realities of modern missile technology, especially in regard to guidance, speed, range, and the advent of armed and semi-autonomous unmanned aerial vehicles, UAV, of increasing lethality. In 2005, the US Navy embarked on a program to replace the existing Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carriers currently comprising the central components of the Aircraft Carrier Strike Groups, ASG, of which the service operates 10.
I've heard this argument before, where the use of new long-range missiles has made aircraft carriers obsolete. However, what these people don't know is that in a combat scenario where the use is fighting overseas, it will need to drop devastating airstrikes from an area close by. A supercarrier with the capability of dropping dozens of airstrikes on a country every day for a month is greatly needed. Now, for the claims that long-range missiles can destroy carriers from far away, they need to know that aircraft carriers always travel in convoys, where frigates and destroyers can detect missiles from far away and even further from striking distance and intercept. Southfront has also forgotten this while praising their new weapon highly bragged by the Russian and Chinese militaries, the hypersonic missile.
Russian and Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonic cruise missiles can strike US carriers long before their aircraft can get within range of striking the territories of either of these near-peer adversaries.
The problem with hypersonic missiles is their heat. The faster an object travels through space, the hotter that object becomes due to friction of materials against the atmosphere. An object traveling at Mach 10 would show up on an infrared sensor like a boil on an ass. And with new anti-hypersonic weapons such as lasers, drones, and the new generation of the standard anti-air missile, this is pretty much going to take it down. This is why the West didn't even bother developing a supersonic version of the TLAM Harpoon missile. Have China or Russia actually demonstrated these hypersonic missiles they claim to have? Of course not, and there's a reason why. Now let's take a look at how Southfront attacks the US air units, starting with the F-18.
As much as President Trump and various administration officials and senators tout the power of the U.S. military, often citing an increasing defense budget as an indicator of strength, efficiency, and effectiveness, there is little doubt that U.S. and naval aviation has atrophied over decades of misuse, neglect, and poor decision-making at the highest levels. Not only is it in disrepair, but it is ill-equipped for a fight against a peer adversary. In the last decade of the Cold War naval competition between the US and the USSR, the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers deployed with 9 or even 10 squadrons of fixed-wing aircraft. Today, that has been reduced to 6. Greater importance, the only aircraft utilized for combat operations is the FA-18 Hornet and Super Hornet, with all of its inherent shortcomings. Most importantly, its limited operational range of 370 nautical miles. The FA-18 is a jack of all trades and a master of none. In an attempt to lower costs by using one airframes for all roles, the US Navy has been left to rely on a less capable tool for many missions. What has resulted is an aircraft carrier air wing that is less capable in all respects and cannot compete and excel in a future conflict with a peer adversary.
Saying that a fully modernized F-18 is obsolete isn't true. F-18s basically beat any other fourth-generation jet as they carry long-range radar and they carry high off-bore sight missiles which can outmaneuver the maneuverable fighters and obviate the need to actually get behind the enemy before firing. It's the equivalent of a MiG-29. Are you saying that those jets are obsolete? But there is another jet that South Front goes against.
Are the F-35C and F-35B Joint Strike Fighters meant to complete the complement of strike and fighter aircraft finally going to be available for deployment? Seeing that the F-35 does not close the missile gap that threatens the U.S. aircraft carriers in general, is the Navy soliciting the defense industry to produce a carrier-borne aircraft, whether manned or unmanned, to correct this obvious weakness? Perhaps the most controversial and scandalous of any such program, the JSF, is the costliest weapons program in world history. Newly revised estimates from the Pentagon put the cost of development and procurement of the 2,056 fighters the DoD wants at $406.1 billion US. The total cost to procure these aircraft and maintain them over the 20-year lifespan of the aircraft exceeds $1.5 trillion US. While the F-35A first flew in 2006, the only U.S. military branch to declare the F-35 operation and to use it in combat is the USMC. The F-35 was developed from the outset for export to allied nations, and Israel has reportedly used the F-35 for strikes against some targets in the Middle East. Approximately 300 units of all versions have been produced so far for both the U.S. military and foreign militaries, yet only Israel and the USMC have declared the aircraft combat ready. Not only has the F-35 not attained a wide operational status 17 years after its first flight, but it has pulled an exorbitant amount of funding from existing combat-proven aircraft.
Now I have to give one disclaimer here. I am not a fan of the F-35 myself at all, and I am glad that several countries are choosing to not use them, but to say that it has no purpose is wrong. As reporters have said, comparing the F-35 to older jets is like comparing an iPhone to a wall-mounted telephone. The aircraft's stealth attributes, computational power, and complex use of data are designed to make it neither seen nor heard, and yet it can detect all other aircraft. It can detect another aircraft from 300 kilometers away, which is far superior to the Su-35's detection system at 50 kilometers. It would be able to jam its frequency and be able to shoot it from a further distance with the MBDA Meteor Beyond Visual Range missile, which is much superior to the Sukhoi 35's Adder missile. While it isn't needed, some variants are already in use and can work in a conflict against China or Russia.
The fact that 62% of the U.S. Navy's F-18s are not mission capable is not an anomaly. In 2017, approximately 72% of all U.S. Air Force aircraft were not flight-worthy. Both the Navy and Air Force claim that there is not enough money in their respective budgets to procure the needed spare parts to keep these aircraft flying. One would wonder that if this is the case, why tens of billions of dollars are being poured into new aircraft when existing fleets are being left in disrepair.
I honestly don't know where they got this from, but knowing that South Front doesn't put any sources, the same applies to this claim, which is why it's easy to dismiss the idea that a country which spends $600 billion on its military doesn't take care of its most important combat assets.
The United States military is in its weakest state of material strength and readiness since the conclusion of the Cold War. The conventional ground forces of the Army have been transformed into a force bent on occupation and counterinsurgency. Its heavy armored formations are in a state of disrepair and material inferiority vis-à-vis its most capable theoretical adversaries. The cornerstone of American power, projection, and intimidation, the aircraft carrier strike groups are a sad shadow of their former self. The carrier air wing, the entire reason that an aircraft carrier exists in the first place, has developed into a tool of increasingly limited utility, with an ever-decreasing reach. In any theoretical situation where the nation finds itself at war against Russia or China, and likely an alliance of the two, the United States military has never been in a weaker position.
But those are basically all their points that South Front makes, which are all wrong because, as you noted, they continue to portray Russia and China as the new dominant forces of the world. I wonder what they meant when they said that a Western victory over Russia and China is pure fantasy. Was it maybe that they could take over the West in a global conflict? If that's so, let's go over the reasons why these two nations are actually the ones that are unprepared for war. Putting aside the fact that Russia has inferior technology and an inferior economic stance, Russia has a total of 845,000 active duty troops as opposed to NATO having around 3 million. The size of the Russian military is actually closer to that of South Korea than the US. It gets even worse when you look at how widespread those troops are. Russia has about 10 to 18 military bases outside their borders as opposed to the US's 600, meaning that its military reach is much smaller. And it all depends on what you can call a base. Their military presence in Cuba has been described as more of a way station than an actual base. Also, Russia's military industrial complex collapsed at the fall of the Soviet Union, and while Putin is trying to build it up, things are moving very slowly. A 20-plus year lull in production is hard to make up for, and in the field of advanced weapons technology, it's almost impossible. This would not benefit Russia in the long term, not in a war against NATO. Again, while having inferior technology, the PLA has a lot of internal issues. While it has made significant gains, the PLA has a poor command structure, which degrades its ability to operate in any conflict zone, including alongside other nations. In a world where transporting troops by air is vital, having them transported by train like China does is a major drawback. The US Pentagon also reported that the Chinese military is vulnerable to cyber attacks, which would cripple many defense components. Now, like how many militaries are sworn to protect the nation as a whole, regardless of politics, this is a little different in China. The PLA is not a national service that belongs to the country, it serves as the Communist Party's armed wing. It puts into question as who is the actual army of China. It's as if the Republican and Democrat parties in the US had their own militaries. Also, the Chinese military lacks something that is necessary for the modern battlefield, and that is a joint command structure, which would make it hard for the branches to communicate as in wartime, especially a nation with the largest army in the world. The PLA has also been accused of being overly political, and a large section of training is just political party doctrine rather than actual warfare. This makes it even worse as the country hasn't taken part in a conflict for a while. Their last military deployment was the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, and the last actual armed conflict they took part in was the Johnson South Reef skirmish in 1988. And finally, as well as worst of all, low recruitment standards are a bad thing. According to the PLA recruitment office in Beijing, all recruits have to pass a rigorous fitness exam to determine if they are fit for combat, and a staggering 80% of recruits fail this exam due to recruits being overweight, underweight, having bad eyesight, or low fitness activity. In order to actually get more recruits, they lowered fitness standards first in 2008 and then again in 2011. Because of this, they will have troops that are not physically fit for combat, and any conflict in the South China Sea would be disastrous for them. China's only real strong points are their missiles, large army, and political morale. This is something that plagues the armies that South Front so solemnly glorifies. But will you hear them talking about it? No, you won't. The reality is that neither Russia nor China have the ability to wage a costly war against the West in the long term. If they have any chance of succeeding, they need to have swift and precise military operations and use it as a diplomatic bargaining chip. A war depends on resources, and the West far outpaced its adversaries in that field. Southfront failed miserably in their so-called analysis, and it just shows that the YouTube channel is not an intelligence provider, but a flawed and biased internet channel. That is why they need to see their internet findings, and I deeply wonder how they would respond if someone calls them out.